All right, welcome everyone to the Hoover Institution workshop on using text as data in policy analysis. My name is Stephen Davis and I organized the workshop with Justin Grimmer. Today we are privileged to have Beatrice Ferrario and Stefanie Stantcheva. Beatrice is a research fellow in the social media lab at Harvard. Stefanie is professor of economics at Harvard and a member of the French Council of Economic Advisors. Today, they will tell us about research that explores people's views about income taxes and estate taxes. To do so, they apply text-based methods to the responses on open-ended survey questions. That's a big methodological topic, and we're eager to see how they tackle it. So here's our format. Stefanie is going to speak, I think, for about 30 minutes. Then we'll turn to a discussion and Q&A. If you have a question or a comment, put it into the Q&A box. I hope I got that right, Tara. Correct me if I didn't. Which Justin and I will moderate. Okay, and depending on the flow of questions, we might just combine questions, paraphrase, or ask you to state your remarks directly. So we'll run this recorded session probably for about 65 minutes. After that, we'll turn the recording off, stick around for anyone who wants to, and have a little more informal discussion that's not recorded. Okay, so Stefanie, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve and Justin, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here among you. So today, as Steve said, I will present work that tries to elicit people's first order concerns on a range of topics here on policy. And that's leveraging the text analysis of open-ended survey questions. And it's joined with Beatrice Ferrario, who is a PhD student at Harvard as well, and is here today too. So the actual starting point for this whole endeavor is a bit of longer standing work that we've been doing on using surveys as sort of a key tool for understanding people's views on public policies. Surveys have been used for a really long time to measure things that today we can see much better in other data. For instance, for a long time, the only way to know people's incomes or whether they get unemployment insurance, etc., was through, asking them through surveys. Today, there's many of these things that we can see in administrative, like tax data, social security data. But there's some things that remain completely invisible in other data, no matter how good it is. And those are things like attitudes, perceptions, reasonings, beliefs. And these are particularly relevant, perhaps, when it comes to public policies. When people think about what policies they should support or oppose, they have a whole range of considerations. They have some understanding of how the policy works. They have some fairness concerns of how the policy plays out on different groups. They have different perceptions of who wins, who loses. And sometimes, as we've shown in other work, they even have different perceptions of today's reality. For instance, how high is the tax rate today? Who's paying what taxes, etc. And so these surveys can shed light on how people reason about important public policies that shape their daily lives, like healthcare, taxation, trade policy, etc. So they can tell us what efficiency, what distributive effects people have in mind when they think about these policies, and what are their perceived goals, social objectives. And the reason that we're relying a lot on these methods is that, as economists, we love typically revealed preference behaviors, by which we mean we love inferring what people think or what their constraints are from behaviors that we observe, sort of inverting the behaviors we see to get these things that are invisible. But there are really limits to this, because sometimes, we can learn about support for some policies by looking at citizens' political behaviors or voting behaviors. But it's not really that we have data on detailed policy preferences, and voting very rarely happens on specific and separate issues. And so it's very difficult to infer people's underlying reasoning from just this observational data, which is actually very coarse. And so acknowledging that surveys are a really, really useful tool, they're typically made of what's called closed-ended questions or multiple choice questions. These are questions that give you some prompt, and then there's specific answer options which are fixed. And these are great, and they're definitely the most used ones, and they allow themselves very nicely for more standardized responses. It's much easier to analyze them. but they have some limits too. In particular, they may prime respondents to think about options they may not have thought about unless they're actually written out there by you, the surveyor. And they may also omit relevant options. It's sometimes difficult for us as researchers, and perhaps that's why we study the topic in the first place, to know what are all the possible relevant options that people may have in mind. And that's where open-ended questions come in. So open-ended questions are questions that don't give a specific set of answers. They actually let the respondent freely write something in response to a question. And they can be, pretty long answers if the question is very broad and general, or they can be relatively short. And what's nice about them is that they don't constrain respondents to specific answer options. And this is why there's such a valuable tool for eliciting what we say are basically first order concerns, namely things that come to people's minds without you prompting them in one direction or the other. The disadvantage perhaps, or the difficulty, is that they're harder to analyze. In particular, they need text analysis methods to actually get that raw text into something that is quantifiable and usable for analysis. And so this is what we're going to do here, illustrated with some particular topics. And there's quite a bit of a related literature. There's obviously the whole literature on perceptions of public policy per se. That's very important, whether it's about tax policy or inequality or other such policies. But the text analysis literature has actually mostly focused on non-survey data. So obviously many people here have probably done such analysis. And this is basically analysis of newspaper articles, analysis of other media posts, sometimes of companies, statements, etc., or political speeches. So very, very valuable analysis of texts that are generated in non-survey context. And the literature on actually analysis of survey data is very, very thin, and it's mostly been done in political science, but it's only a few isolated really examples, and it's only now in basically the last year that this has started to take off, and I think it's going to take off more and more. So in this particular project here, we're going to focus on two major policies in the US. These policies are the income tax and the estate tax. But in case we have more time during the Q&A, and just to perhaps attract your attention to it, I did put at the end of the talk additional materials for trade policy as well, which we have also analyzed using these methods. The data comes from large-scale surveys of US respondents that are aged 18 to 70. So we have a bit more than 5,000 respondents. And they're done in such a way that they're broadly representative of the US population along the dimensions of gender, age, income, political affiliation, and employment status. So obviously no survey is perfectly representative, and happy to talk more about exactly how the people are recruited. In a nutshell, it's through commercial survey companies that basically run surveys for commercial purposes for typically corporate clients. So these are not people that are necessarily used to taking surveys on political issues or economic issues. And people are rewarded with a range of incentives that range from cash to frequent flyer points. And it's thanks to that you can get a pretty broad slice of the US population. You never really get the very bottom of the distribution, and you never really get the very top of the distribution either. But you get a very good sizable representative chunk over a broad middle range. And so using this survey data, we're going to first present the application of text analysis methods to open-ended survey questions, and then actually show you some key results that emerge about people's first order considerations on income and estate taxation. And here, for the sake of conciseness, we're going to focus actually on the partisan divergences that occur in how people talk about taxes. And as I said, there's more things on trade policy if you're interested. So first of all, let's start with a bit more methodological points before diving into the income and estate tax topics. So what do open-ended survey questions answers even measure? They can be very broad and big picture. For instance, one example here will be, when you think about federal personal income taxes, what are the main considerations that come to your mind? Very broad. We're not asking them about necessarily specific shortcomings or specific good things about it, specific groups. It's a very broad question, very big picture. But they can go to much more narrower and targeted questions. For instance, also examples that we ask, well, what would be the effects on the US economy if the federal personal income taxes were increased? Or which groups do you think would lose if the estate tax were increased? So much more precise now, focusing people on a particular aspect of that policy. And so what we think happens when people answer these questions is that they're telling us really their first order concerns and reactions that are really top of mind to them. And so here we can distinguish between sort of two types of respondents. One type of respondent has sort of never thought about this topic. You know, this may be the first time they really consider this in an explicit way. These people may just give some gut reaction. Other people may have thought about it, you know, carefully over time. They may have formed some opinions, and they may express something that, you know, is top of mind to them, but it has been reflected upon, so more profound views. Either way, regardless of which respondent this is very much their first order reaction. And it's kind of what's relevant, if you want, for policy today, unless there is more education done on these topics or unless there's further information provided on these topics. So if you wanted to get a sense of today, what are the concerns of people as they are, you know, whether they thought about it or not, these are pretty good sort of indicators here. And so once you have these questions, and actually let me go slightly back on the slide and say, and that's why also the design of the questions is very critical. So before you even go to the text analysis part, since you are creating your own data here, unlike the analysis of existing text from other sources, a lot of the work, perhaps most of the work, is in the design stage of these questions. And so thinking about obviously going first from the broader ones, which don't prime people at all about specific aspects, to narrower and narrower questions that become more and more targeted. And it's really by making the questions precise enough, controlled enough, that you can get useful answers to this. Once you do have the answers and the text for your analysis, that's when you go into the actual text analysis part. And so as probably many of you are familiar with here, so I'll go quickly. I'm not sure to what extent, you know, people do this hands-on or not, but some of the things are very common to any other text analysis. Here, it does not matter that this is survey data, but it will matter for some other aspects. So the pre-processing steps, where you sort of clean this messy raw text data to make it analyzable, are very common. These are, you know, steps of parsing the answers to reduce the number of distinct text elements that you have. So for instance, you're removing punctuation, spaces, stop words that are not having any meaning, etc. You also, you know, lemmatize the groups to make them into the single form of the word. You know, policies and policy will be treated as the same, were and be will be treated as the same, etc. And then, you know, something that's actually relevant for survey data specifically is that you should remove words that feature in the question or that are structurally part of answers. So you don't really want to have words in there like I think or I believe. You know, those are not informative, they're sort of structural part of the answers. And then once you've cleaned the data, there's a couple of ways to actually look at it. So one of the most, you know, useful purely visualization tools is, of course, word clouds, which allow you to literally see the data in a more intuitive way. So for word clouds, the only choice you really have to make is to choose the size of word groups you're interested in, basically the so-called n-grams. For instance, given the short answers in surveys, really the most useful are 1 or 2 grams at best. So groups of 1 word or 2 words. In longer text, this may be very different. You may be interested in particular sentences, in particular expressions. This is typically not the case with a much shorter survey answer, you know, much shorter than, say, a political speech or a newspaper article. And then once you plot them, the font size will basically be proportional to the frequency of each n-gram. And so this is great as a first step in visualizing the data and scanning the answers. But it's perhaps a little bit it's a little bit dangerous for sort of survey data, which again is not a long text, but rather a short text, because it can lead you to wrongfully actually not account for synonyms. So for instance, one thing that we saw in the tax data, a word like flat tax is going to appear as a key word in the word clouds, because it's something that is a very defined term and doesn't really have too many synonyms that people use. If you want, it's a buzzword that you can throw around. But other things, that concern essentially the same issues, for instance, worrying about low-income people, is going to appear with the words low income, poor, families, etc. And those will get diluted. So in a sense, topics that are actually very prevalent, but that have many ways of being expressed, will be somewhat artificially diluted, while buzzwordy topics that have only one term really to designate them will be artificially inflated. So word clouds are useful, but in survey data, it's mainly to use as a first step in visualizing the data. More useful for survey data is what's called Keyness analysis. So Keyness analysis is based on a relative frequency analysis. So here, we're not going to worry about how frequently does a word appear, but we're going to worry about how frequently does a word appear in a reference group relative to a target group. And so it's going to be about relative to each other, how frequently do two groups mention a given word or group of words. And so the keenness score of a word group or an n-gram is going to be based on the chi-square test statistic for the null hypothesis that the propensity to use this group of words is the same for the reference and the target group. And so intuitively, words that have a high keenness score are used relatively more frequently by the target group than by the reference group. So this is something that allows you to say these keywords are very characteristic of a given group. They tend to appear disproportionately in that group. And so, for instance, this is used here for political affiliation. We're going to see words that are particularly used by Democrats versus Republicans. And then the final really useful method of analysis for survey answers is topic analysis. So topic analysis is very simple. It's basically defining topics based on keywords. So for instance, a topic about distribution may include keywords like low income, poor, high income, millionaires, etc. And so different topics will be defined by different sets of keywords. So that part is very simple. The harder part is making the choice about how to extract the topics from the text. So are you going to go entirely sort of unsupervised, unleash algorithms which are out there, which are written to extract sort of topics, or semi-supervised, or more like manually, actually, looking at tabulating all the topics, seeing what comes up a lot, grouping the words in a way that makes sense. And so really here, the choice depends on the type of text again. And you see that this is a recurring theme where many of the text analysis methods are developed for longer text typically, and they work well on long text. But we have this specific challenge with survey data that answers are much shorter. And so depending on the type of text, depending on basically how much you're asking of respondents, you would choose a slightly different method. In general, we think that given the length of answers and the fact that the samples are typically manageable, it's thousands of respondents, it's not millions of pages of text. Topics, we go a little bit more manually. So we use keywords, sets of keywords that we choose that can then be sort of cross-checked by semi-supervised algorithms, and for which you can also very well check the sensitivity. So omitting some keywords, does that actually change the results a lot? Dropping some of them, adding some of them, etc. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the key methodological points here of how we design the questions, analyze the data. And so now let's look at a bit of an application to see why this is useful. And so here, the survey contains many, many questions. And if you're interested in seeing sort of the full range of analysis and answers, if you're particularly interested in taxes, the appendix has basically a whole range of additional analysis. But in the main text and here in the talk, let's focus on the answers to the very broad question, which is, what are your main considerations when thinking about income taxes, or someone else will be asked about estate taxes? And so we can see, for instance, to the point of word clouds, just a very simple distribution of responses. So here it's 2 grams, so it's groups of 2 words. So this is the responses for the income tax question. And here you see that people express actually disagreement with current levels of taxes. And they have different views on the direction in which to change them, lower tax, higher tax, depending on the groups they refer to in the question. You know, some of them will be talking about lower taxes for middle class, others will be talking about higher taxes for the rich. But, you know, people are talking about changing taxes. And then people talk about concerns about the middle class a lot. So sort of useful, but you wouldn't be able to do that much with this info here. The estate tax actually turns out to be pretty useful. And again, it's the point about there's a buzzword here that you see immediately, and that's actually very relevant for the estate tax. So for the estate tax, it jumps at you that some of the major concerns that people have center around double taxation. And that will be a recurring theme. People worry about the estate tax as being income that has already been taxed, and so it's an unfair double tax. People mention a lot the fairness aspect of it, and then it's followed by concerns about the middle class and also family. So much more interesting are the topic distributions that come out. So in this figure here, you can see the distribution of topic in respondents' answers by political affiliation. So for the income tax, there's actually 8 distinct topics here. So we give the names for these topics. The distribution, fairness, government spending, social safety net, efficiency, flat tax, as I mentioned, a buzzword, loopholes, public goods, and then don't know, where that last topic is basically for people who mention things around, you know, I don't know enough, I can't answer. So the keywords, for instance, like distribution, in the distribution topic, it's keywords like middle class, low income, millionaire. The fairness issue is words like fair or unfair. Some other examples, the public goods will be things like infrastructure, healthcare. And then efficiency is represented by words like hurt the economy, work less, competition, spend less, among others. And so you see that in this case, the topics of distribution and fairness, as well as government spending, are some of the most frequently mentioned ones. So the efficiency topic, in a very sad way for us economists, and for me particularly, who's spent years studying the effects of taxes on various things, the efficiency topic does not appear to be top of mind for people. And you may look at this and say, okay, now what do we do with this? Well, the answer is, one way to go fruitfully is to use the topics that come up a lot and dig into them further. And that's exactly what we do when we design the surveys. When we see that people talk a lot about fairness, about distribution, we design subsequent questions to drill down into those. And I've analyzed this in another paper called Understanding Taxes, How Do People Reason? And it's exactly consistent with these answers. Basically, when you analyze this much more rigorously with many more questions and analysis, it's really distributional and fairness topics that dominate people's minds when thinking about tax policy views, much more so than efficiency concerns. And you can really see here that people's open-ended questions here provide meaningful insights into what matters to them, and that can be confirmed with much deeper, much more rigorous analysis. It's also interesting to see that the fairness topic is very equally represented along the political spectrum, and other topics are not. So, for instance, the distribution topic is much more prevalent on the left of the political spectrum than it is on the right. So, for instance, 50% of the topics mentioned by Clinton liberals here in dark blue are about distribution topics, and then 25% only are by Trump conservatives, which is the red topic. And by the way, this classification of people into political groups is based on several questions. So asking them who they voted for or who they wanted to vote for and where they placed themselves on the spectrum between very conservative and very liberal. And so those are the 4 groups that basically appear meaningfully in the sample. There's other categories, but they're very, very small. For instance, someone who says they're Trump liberal is very, very small. Other topics like government spending, you see, is a much more pressing concern on the right of the political spectrum. It accounts for less than 4% of all mentions among Clinton liberals, but a quarter of mentions for Trump conservatives. And then again, efficiency is just not a topic anywhere in the political spectrum. And so what's up with this fairness topic that is so equally distributed? Well, it's because everybody cares basically equally about fairness across the political spectrum, but fairness will just mean incredibly different things to different people. So fairness is really in the eye of the beholder. And this is why that, sort of prompts you to want to do more, to dig more into exactly what is it that fairness means to different people with a series of follow-up questions and studies, and to understand what that means. And so this is a good guide for additional work that can be done to really dig into what's important here. Let me show you also the distribution for the estate tax. So this is for the estate tax. So for the estate tax, the topics are quite similar to those from the income tax survey. There's some things that are specific to the estate tax. So we already mentioned this double tax topic. And indeed, although it's a buzzword, it is truly very, very prevalent. So this includes additional words like already paid, already taxed, or taxed twice, which also capture this double taxation aspect. And then another thing that's actually a very small topic, but does appear specifically for the estate tax, are things related to grief, bury, funeral, etc. So the distribution of topics is again heavily centered around distribution issues and fairness, but the double tax topic also carries a lot of weight. And by splitting it by political affiliation, you can see that it is really a topic that is very pronounced on the right, so among Trump conservatives, and actually in the end, relatively rare on the left. So double taxation is a prevalent concern mostly to the right of the political spectrum. And again, fairness issues are more or less equally distributed here across the political spectrum. Furthermore, if you look at the very bottom right panel, you see that there's quite a bit of people who say they don't know enough about the estate tax. This is actually much higher than the people who say they don't know enough about the income tax, which also makes sense. The estate tax is not necessarily something that people think about every year when they file their taxes. The income tax presumably is. And so another thing that we can use to confirm these topic distributions is this keyness analysis. And so this figure here shows you the keywords that are most specific to Democrats in blue or to Republicans in red. So these are words that are not necessarily used much more in absolute terms, but that are used much more among Democrats in blue or among Republicans in red. And sort of the significant stars here are the significance for the statistical test of the frequencies being different between the two groups. So you see that consistent with the topic distribution, the keywords on the Democrat side center around issues of distribution: poor, rich, lower class, middle class, tax wealthy, while Republicans tend to emphasize government spending, government waste, and people work, economy spend, things about the economic costs. For the estate tax, there's also significant differences here by political leanings, where it looks very similar. Again, distribution mainly on one side and more about government and family, etc. on the other side. And so we can also look at more specific questions, narrower questions. So instead of this broad questions on main concerns, remember more targeted questions could be, for instance, who gains if taxes on high earners were to be increased? So it's a pretty precise question, but it's not giving you a list of options. You just have to say, if I think about when tax on high earners are increased, who will be the winners? What do I say? And here we plotted again among Democrats, the frequency of answers among Democrats on the horizontal axis and the frequency of answers among Republicans on the vertical axis. And among Democrats, you see very prevalent answers are the middle class. So if tax on high earners are increased, the middle class will gain, or everybody will gain. That's also relatively frequent. Among Republicans, frequent answers are exactly the opposite. Nobody will gain if tax on middle class, on high earners are increased, or the government and politicians. And this reflects a little bit this belief that, again, you can check with much further detailed questions and analysis, this belief in trickle down, which is if you increase tax on high earners, everybody loses. On the other hand, if you decrease tax on high earners, it's going to be sort of the tide that lifts all boats. It's going to trickle down. And then we can see very similar patterns if we look at the perceived winners and losers from the estate tax. So here, who's going to lose if the estate tax is increased? Again, among Republicans, frequent answers are the middle class itself will lose, everybody will lose, families will lose. And so it's very, very consistent. There's a few other, topics that we can cover, but another thing you can do is to split for different groups, of course. So political affiliation is only one of the splits of the data that you can look at. But you can, of course, and if you're interested, you can take a look at the appendix for splits by age groups, by education groups, by income groups. The reason we show political groups here is that this is the biggest heterogeneity. So the biggest sort of differences on tax issues, perhaps not surprisingly, it's almost the quintessential partisan topic are by political affiliation. If you look at age here with the same topics and just look at the distribution of topics, there's not super strong patterns. Older respondents tend to have slightly different concerns with income taxes, but it's really nothing that necessarily jumps at you very, very strongly. If you look at the keywords analysis, older respondents have a slight tendency to mention more things related to government waste, budget, social security, but younger respondents tend to focus a little bit more on the cost of living, affordability, healthcare, etc. But not that strong patterns relative to other things. And so to conclude just the part on taxes, and we can talk about more things during the Q&A, on taxes and more generally on public policy, open-ended survey questions offer a real potential to elicit people's first-order considerations on policy issues. By not constraining respondents to a given fixed, answer set that is given by us surveyors, they avoid priming people into thinking about options they may not have picked otherwise, or omitting relevant options that we don't know yet about. And so they can range from much broader, for instance, what are your main considerations overall, to much more targeted, what are the effects on which groups if you increase a given tax. Once you have that data, you can leverage recent and very much ongoing advances in text analysis for visualization and quantitative study. And they're really a prompt for further analysis. So I tried to give you examples here. For instance, once you see that the fairness topic is so important and so evenly split, it makes you want to drill down further into what does it mean for things to be fair, and it sort of prompts further analysis. And we think it can yield a lot of new insights across many areas of economics. And so to again mention, if you are interested in trade policy and you want to ask some questions about that in the Q&A, I have some slides here for that in case it's interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefanie. That was extremely clear and interesting. I think I'm going to turn to Justin first, and then Aaron Carter. We'll go to you next. And if Tara, if you can open the mic to Aaron when the time comes, and then maybe I'll go third with some questions as well.
Excellent. That was a spectacular presentation. I have a whole bunch of questions. I'll limit it to one to start it since we have a queue. I'm curious what we can learn about intensity from the open-ended responses. So you spent a lot of time talking about position, and I'm curious how one might think about the intensity with which someone holds that particular view. A few ideas come to mind. One could think about perhaps mentioning many topics rather than one, or perhaps it has something to do with the length of the response, or maybe they use particularly passionate language, if it's particularly colored language, swear words, that sort of thing, could like convey that this is a thing that really gets them animated or passionate. as compared to the, the don't knows provide a really nice way to think about that. Just curious how you're thinking about that or how you might extract intensity.
I think this is a really excellent point, because absolutely language also conveys some sentiment in addition to content. And there's clearly lots of also advances in sentiment analysis. So absolutely something to be leveraged. We tried that a little bit, but only in terms of positive tone and negative tone. So in a very, if you want, a very restricted, narrow sense from what you're suggesting. Then absolutely, I think you're mentioning incredibly interesting things to do. There's lots of words in there, and that can convey strength of emotion. Another thing that can be used is also the length of the answer. So you mentioned the number of topics mentioned. Absolutely, many people mention several topics, and so clearly have formed stronger views, but also just the length of the answer, especially once you filter out some demographics. For instance, older respondents tend to answer longer answers than younger ones. So ideally when you're not interested in the intensity, just in the content, you want to normalize for that, but it is an expression of intensity too. So I think lots more things to do here and to analyze. And then, the final thing I'll say is you can also ask specific questions about that too. So we have other measures, about how much people try to stay afloat of economic news, how self-reportedly knowledgeable they are, although we can cross-check that with actual answers, or how passionately they feel about that. So you can also use those other cross measures too. But I think sentiment analysis is super important and interesting thing to look at more. Thank you.
Erin, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for a really fascinating talk. So I have a few questions about your survey methods here. So first, this question is based on a paper that a co-author and I published recently, and we looked at Americans' foreign policy views. And what we found is that one of the strongest drivers of sort of differential answer response, both in sort of the specific questions and also the open-ended questions, was actually media consumption rather than partisanship. And in those bar plots that you had, they were very interesting. You broke things down by partisanship. I'm curious whether you did the same thing by media consumption, in particular very partisan sources, and what those results look like, if you could share anything about that. And that, that sort of, leads to a related question, which is that for survey methodologists, a really important issue is vignette anchoring, right? So making sure people, if you use a very charged term like death tax or something like that, or even if you use a term that's relatively neutral, but people are consuming a lot of partisan media that makes them immediately think of it in a more charged way, that seems to be particularly an issue in a topic that is sort of as substantively charged as this one. So I'm curious about how you think about that issue as well. But thank you for an interesting talk.
Great, thank you very much for the question. So I'm actually very curious to hear also your thoughts on the first one. So let me answer about the media versus political affiliation correlation. So we asked them about their media consumption too, and what we found is that once you break it into such detailed groups, and that's partially why we did it, not just, for instance, Republican, Democrat, but actually, Trump voter and conservative, Trump voter and moderate, Clinton voter, etc. And this was obviously before the 2020 election, right before. Once you break it down like that, it becomes incredibly correlated with media consumption. And so the sources that people mention as main sources of either economic news or general news become extremely, extremely correlated with this classification. And so the patterns would look very similar by sort of, if you classified media from, let's say, very left-wing to very right-wing. Now, perhaps there's other media classifications to look at as well, but, and I think that could be something very interesting to do. And I'll be very, very interested in your, in your take based on media consumption. But for us, they're super strongly correlated with these finer political affiliations. They're not very strongly correlated with just, say, Republican, Democrat. So that is a sort of different measure. I agree. On your second question about particularly charged terms, yes, absolutely. So that's something very, very relevant. And so we always have to make a choice, as you know, as a surveyor, of what are you after here? Are you trying to prime people? Sometimes that's an actual experimental treatment. Are you priming people to think about a particular direction, and then testing that relative to a control group that wasn't? And it's funny that you mentioned death tax, because in another project we did that. Basically, if you just mention the word death tax, it's bad, as you can imagine, as opposed to calling it the estate tax. And so you have to sort of make the choice of what you're really after. Here, we're after, in a sense, the most neutral formulation so that we do not prime people to bring that up if they don't have it in mind. And so we ask about the federal estate tax, which is sort of the official neutral term. And then as you see, some people do mention issues like grief, death, family, sort of organically, they mention it, even if we did not raise it. But it's a constant choice in a sense of what you're after. Sometimes it's intentionally priming to elicit an effect. Sometimes you're trying to stay, it's impossible to be totally neutral, but you're trying to stay as neutral as possible to get people's reactions.
Aaron, did you have a follow-up or?
I think that's really interesting. So I think like empirically, it might be really interesting to look at if sort of people who are consuming more partisan media sort of have a tighter linkage between sort of a neutrally framed issue and using sort of more substantively extreme language. Like that would be a very interesting sort of, thing you could quantify and see if that varies across different media consumption types or something like that. But thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. So I wanted to drill down into some of your conclusions and either express some notes of skepticism, which you may allay, or just tell me. Well, one, I want to start with a very, and I'm going to look at your keyword terms that you use to define topics. One, this may just be a typo, but in your double tax category for the estate tax, your list of keywords doesn't include double tax. That's what it says in your appendix. Is that just an oversight, or do you in fact exclude double tax from the double tax category?
No, that's just because it's already in the title. Sorry.
Okay, so
it was just not
good.
repeated. Yes, absolutely, it's there.
Okay, so it's there. That's good. Okay, good. Then I want to get two conceptual issues, which I'm sure you've thought about, and I want to hear your thoughts on how you deal with them. So there's obviously plenty of scope for people to express an idea in multiple ways, and so that's why there's a fair bit of judgment, involved in the choice of the term. So the flat tax. Okay, so now there are multiple arguments for the flat tax. People make fairness arguments, they make efficiency arguments, they make complexity, administrative efficiency arguments. And you didn't include, for the flat tax category, you just have flat tax. And even the example you gave, you have somebody complaining about tax forms are too complex. That could be seen as a call for a flat tax. I think that in your example, that person did give a flat tax, but somewhere along the line, you made a judgment that if somebody rails about the complexity of filling out your individual income tax system, not to put that in the flat tax category. And so I just wanted to hear your thinking about that. And then I'll ask another question. This is a bigger question. I'm not sure you should be quite as sad as you profess to be about the lack of attention to efficiency in the questions, because here again, there's some challenging conceptual issues. Some of what goes in your government spending category is about efficiency in a sense. It's about efficiency on the spending side. So you got people complaining about wasteful government spending. And it's perfectly reasonable to think that higher income taxes are inefficient because they generate inefficiencies on the spending side. So you didn't put that in there. And then there's, again, the flat tax, at least from one of the arguments economists make in favor of flat taxes are efficiency arguments. Same for the anti-loophole thing, which by the way is again, possibly connected to the flat tax, because part of the virtue of the flat tax idea is you get away from loopholes. So as I look at them, I may be forgetting some, but loopholes, flat tax, government spending, in some sense, a chunk of those could all be put in the efficiency category. And you didn't do that, which is fine, but I think at least you want to frame your characterization of the efficiency results a little bit differently than you did today.
Very, very important points here. Thank you, Steve. So first of all, the topics are, they're obviously defined in a given way. And so efficiency, we do also in the paper discuss it as economic efficiency from the point of view of like behavioral responses of people to taxes. So it's, if you want, like what what we would study in public econ. Will people work less? Will it generate less activity? So really from the people side, economy side, not from the government side. Everything about government waste, etc., is basically in the government spending side, where people sort of indissociably talk about spending with being wasteful or overspending or not dealing with spending well. So that's basically that spending topic. And then the loopholes are very specifically about evasion and avoidance. And so you could certainly say, oh, let me define a broader efficiency topic where I group these all together, which would be about, let's call it, economic cost, economic waste, whatever it is, a broader efficiency topic. And you can sort of stack them if you want and sort of see, okay, now all of these taken together start to matter more. Absolutely. So very possible to do it there and say, okay, still become smaller than distribution topic, etc. Either way, these are very much, and I hope I also pitched it that way, these are very much like a first step to sort of motivate further analysis. And in the other paper I mentioned about understanding taxes, it's exactly about sort of horse racing and decomposing policy views into what's views on the government, what's views on specific efficiency costs, what's with, very detailed sort of questions on all of these. And there it's sort of a finding that while people differ very much in their perceived economic cost of taxes, very strongly, it kind of gets swamped by their even bigger differences in who they think gains and loses from taxes and how deserving they think these groups are. So in a sense, people who think they're high efficiency costs of taxes may still support very high and progressive taxes because even stronger for them is the concern about inequality, for instance, and vice versa. And there, to your point, actually, views on government also appear as one of the major predictors of tax policy views. So how efficient, how trustworthy, basically how effective the government is another major predictor of people's tax policy views. So you're totally right to point that out as potentially being a very big topic. Yeah. And here it appears like government spending does jump out as a also more frequent topic.
Right, thanks. And let me also a different tack. I'm following up on one of Aaron's questions and comments. If you run this survey again, this kind of survey again, it'd be great to see some variation on questions and sensitivity analysis. So if you go back to your remarks about the estate tax versus the death tax.
Yes.
Estate tax is probably the most neutral term.
Yes.
But it's not a completely neutral term in the political context. We know this from, like, I think Jens Shapiro work, how Democrats tend to use estate tax and Republicans tend to use death tax. So in some settings, it just may be impossible to come up with a totally neutral term. Right. And there especially, you might just want to randomize over the respondents. And kind of more generally, there was a few places in looking over your survey where I wanted to see some randomization, just as a device to see how much it matters.
Yes, point very well taken. And we do like to do that a lot in general, since we don't really know what's the exactly right way to sort of randomize, see if it matters or not. And we can certainly do it much more. And yes, this is absolutely ongoing work that will keep being expanded. And so well noted on randomizing some of the formulations and actually seeing if the distributions of answers then look different. Thank you. On tax topic, I have to say it's very hard to find neutral terms. I agree with you. It's a very polarized topic. Yes.
Okay, I see we've got 3 more questions lined up. So Jonathan Rodden, can we let Jonathan speak, and then we'll go to Simon Sheng and then Benjamin Noble.
Oh, hi. Yeah, just very quickly, I'm just wondering whether you've, we've been going about this a certain way since the beginning of survey research, and you're proposing something very different. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you've done thus far to try to kind of tease out what kinds of things are we learning from the open-ended approach that we just couldn't have gotten from the closed-ended approach. And it leads to this sense of, this question about what we've been missing by asking these closed-ended questions, and what kinds of I guess the main question is, what are the main advantages of this? I'm thinking in particular about time series analysis. And one of the things that's hard is when you're looking at issue-based questions, the survey researchers don't catch up with the public for several years. Something is really top of mind for lots of voters, but we don't start asking the right questions for several cycles, and then we're missing all this really important information. Is that the kind of thing, is this a way to get around that kind of problem? Just, what kinds of things from the old school approach can we improve on from this? And have you done anything kind of more rigorous to help answer that question?
Great. Thank you so much. It's an excellent question. And perhaps here the topics I've picked are not the best application of figuring out new things, because people have thought a lot in general about tax policy. It's something that, has been around and for a very long time. So here I'm using it almost more like a proof of concept of the things people mention in these open-ended questions turn out to also be like, upon further scrutiny, the very important drivers. And so it's really like measuring first order concerns. But absolutely, to what can, one other thing I mentioned is that this can help us learn things that we otherwise would miss. And exactly when topics are changing or when new policy debates come in, we may be very bad at designing answer options in a fixed way. We may not get at what people actually care about and focus. And I think that's something that is seen on other policy issues, which are much more evolving. So for instance, climate policies. We just completed a survey in 20 countries with the OECD. And we actually start with some open-ended questions there too. And the first thing you can see is it's very different across countries. And so already just to get it right across countries would necessitate the sort of pre-work of extracting some concerns that you may not know about. And because the policies are evolving quite rapidly, different things are being proposed to deal with this problem. It's also something where, to your point, we do not have very well-established fixed surveys that will do a good job necessarily to adapt to that. So policies that are in flux or that keep evolving are a very good candidate for this use of open-ended question, which is find out things that you don't know about that people think about. For other topics that are more established, like taxes, I think the value is to actually really see what matters most instead of sort of, oh, maybe I didn't know about this necessarily, but rather what is top of mind that I may not know. This is the thing that's top of mind to people. So that's how I sort of see it. And I'll give you another example of an application here, actually, that's a bit less about policy views, but a bit more about understanding how people will react to some policies. So for instance, think of all these stimulus checks that were sent out and in general, fiscal stimulus done. It's a big topic, and we have lots of macro models on how people will spend or not spend or save. But they're very, they will be observationally equivalent in many cases. We still don't exactly know the underlying ways that people think about it, reason about it, etc. And so there we're applying this by actually trying to understand what people will do. Say if they get a check today, will they spend part of it? Will they save part of it? If yes, why? Why are the reasons they're doing this? What's their thinking? Over what horizon are they thinking about this? And drilling down in these, it's very important to actually have open-ended things, because people mention things that we didn't think about at all. Like, oh, I'm actually saving for a graduation in a month and I want that gift, or other challenges that we did not know about. So it becomes much more exploratory of what are the channels that we're missing and that are actually important.
Great, thanks. Simon, you're up.
Okay, I can see how open-ended questions can help in answer questions such as, hey, what is the major problem facing US economy today?
Yeah.
Right, people will say inflation and so on. Okay, now suppose I want to know more specific information about, say, firm the CEOs, their investment or their unit cost, right, a year from today. I mean, typically people give them multiple choice and even the intervals are some probabilities. So I'm thinking, how can I use open-ended question to elicit more numerical information about the CEOs or even household expectation about future and the associated uncertainty? Can you make some comment on that, please? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. So when it's quantitative answers, it's a slightly different issue here, because now it becomes very much about what's the most accurate and simplest way in which people will, enter a number that makes sense. So I would view this as a different topic. These open-ended questions are not geared towards things that have a quantitative answer, like what do you expect inflation to be in 3 months, or what is your household income? That's not the topic here. But I can tell you something about the about numerical questions, which is there's a lot of research on what will make people sort of give the most accurate answer, and it's clearly not neutral there either. To Steve's point, how you ask, even for something like what's your inflation expectation, it's been shown that the groups of numbers you give may prime people, because they, if you give like also very high options, you're priming them to think about those, etc. The giving a slider versus entering in a text box has different propensities to error or to skip the question, etc. So there's lots of considerations there. The conceptual issues are not necessarily the same, because there it becomes really about how can I extract the most sort of accurate thing, as opposed to let me not steer people in a given direction. But there is some overlap on that particular part about, if you don't want to prime people to think about specific numbers, then you may consider having a, just an open text box, where the danger for numbers is that it tends to be skipped more because it takes more work to enter a number rather than select an option. And it can be prone to typos or people entering, other symbols, etc.
There's also a role for open-ended responses to understand the quantitative value that you elicited. I'll give you an example.
Yes,
so
right.
as someone who's tried to elicit unit cost measures of inflation from firms,
so
and
hard.
you think about what a firm does, what does it mean?
Yes.
So I could easily imagine, after asking them their unit cost number, well,
Yes.
what does unit cost mean for you? And I think you're going to get different answers.
Completely agree.
Section. So there's a role here to combine these approaches.
Totally, absolutely. That's actually a really, really great example of sort of understanding questions that are really important when you ask people about something, I think, to what does this even mean to you? Absolutely. And maybe even before you then actually try to explain to them what you mean as a surveyor, to actually get their intuitive understanding of it. And absolutely, these open-ended questions are not supposed to become the only questions used in a survey here. I'm planning to still do plenty of stuff with closed-ended multiple choice, but it's a useful tool to add to the toolbox. That's all, in conjunction with many other forms of questions that we typically use.
Okay, Benjamin Noble is up next, and then Brett Carter will go to you.
Thanks. This was an interesting talk. I'm curious, you're sort of getting at this about the extent to which you can use these open-ended responses to explore and generate hypotheses that you're going to go test with closed-ended questions later, versus actually testing a hypothesis using an open-ended question. And if you would do that, how might you think about doing that? Thanks.
Great question. And like with the other survey questions, you can really do both. So the one approach is, sort of agnostically try to see, almost as a preliminary analysis, what comes out. In Steve's example, for instance, if you're thinking of how to design the unit cost question better, maybe you want to first generate lots of data on what people actually understand, what are the various definitions people have out there here for taxes, what are the concerns. But then, in a sense, they're also like normal survey questions in that they can be part of a broader strategy. So for instance, in a paper where we are interested in how people think about immigrants, which we've done, we were trying to see whether it matters if people are prompted to think about immigrants before they ask questions on redistribution policy. So without providing any info, if I just put you in the mindset of thinking about immigration, will you then say different things about tax policy, social insurance, etc. And so there you randomly invert the order in which you ask questions. And so then the questions themselves become, to your point, the tool for testing a hypothesis, which is that thinking about immigration reduces your support for redistribution. So very much depends on what question you set out with. And so either these open-ended questions can be exploratory tools to then elicit concerns and dive into further analysis, or they can be used like any other question inside a whole experimental strategy.
Right, thank you. Brett Carter.
Thanks so much for your presentation, which, like many of my colleagues, I found very interesting indeed. So I'd like to go back to this idea of intensity, which with which I think Justin kind of began the discussion. So I suppose one approach would be to take the words that come out of kind of a Keyness analysis, right? And then or kind of the words with a high Keyness score that maybe kind of constitute kind of the tax policy discussion, right? Or some other kind of coverage topic, or some other kind of issue area, and put those words through a linguistic or a sentiment dictionary, right? So the Harvard General Inquirer is kind of the obvious one that comes to mind, and then you could kind of measure word hits, right? And this could give you then some kind of continuous-ish measure of positive or negative sentiment. The General Inquirer has kind of more fine-grained dictionaries as well, right? So you could presumably get some measure of I don't know, some kind of finer grained sentiment. But I'm curious if you have if you're thinking of any other kind of different, potentially more clever ways to get at intensity. I mean, I guess that the open-ended kind of classification is nice, but I don't know. I guess I'm just kind of really curious about this idea of intensity and potentially clever ways to measure it. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you for the question. I think the Harvard tool is very good, and we did try the positive, negative aspect of it, just not showing here because there's too many topics and results already. But I feel like I answered, my answer to Justin was basically my best take on how to measure intensity, and Justin also suggested some ideas, himself about the length of the answers, the number of topics mentioned. There's words that capture, more strong views rather than toned down views. We do show here, but the don't know topic, which suggests, lack of knowledge or interest. And then I also spoke about additional questions to ask more directly to get a sort of strength of feeling about this, whether it's how interested people are in this topic or how knowledgeable they feel they are, and also their media consumption on these issues. So that's sort of my best toolbox here of thinking about measuring intensity. I think another related topic would be about like confidence. So that's something that's also a big topic, in general, like how confident people are in their opinions. And so here, what we do is to actually, we also have lots of questions which are, you can call them factual knowledge questions that are analyzed in this other paper I mentioned on understanding taxes, which are things like, how high is the top tax rate? How many people pay the estate tax? What share of income goes to each group, etc. So not basic that they're easy, but simple knowledge questions that are well defined and have sort of one right answer or a range of an interval of correct answers. And we can then ask people, would you be willing to pay for the accurate answers on these topics? And we do it in a specific way with a lottery so that they can actually play with relatively big amounts of money. And what we see there is that people who are less accurate, so who give less accurate answers to all these knowledge questions, are also less willing to pay for the accurate information. And that's a recurrent finding in many settings that there's this feedback loop. Sort of, if you don't know much about a topic, it could be that you're not interested in it. That's why you don't know as much in the first place. Or it could be that you're very confident in your knowledge. That's why you don't seek out more accurate info, and that's why you're less accurate to start with. But there is clearly that feedback loop that is recurring. So that, I think, is another area that's very interesting to think about, more like confidence in your views versus seeking out expert opinions. And obviously Steve knows a lot about all these topics too. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Zachary Levy.
Hi, well, thank you very much for this discussion. This is fantastic. And I didn't mean to do a plug for the company I work for. I apologize for that. But regarding measuring emotion, our co-founder and CEO used to be a senior vice president at Citigroup. And while he was there throughout the mortgage crisis, he was in charge of a very toxic portfolio of assets, right? And one of the things he did was he said, hey, do we have any behavioral scientists here to help people, you know, with empathy and sympathy, think about how to keep them in their homes? And back in 2008, this was the first time that any of the big banks started thinking this way about their clients, their customers. And then, of course, a lot of the banks have now kind of found ways to bring in behavior scientists, things like that, to help them do this. The company I work for, their technology is funded by the US government at a university. And our co-founder went to a Harvard course and figure out ways to bring in some of Paul Ekman's original research, you know, core foundations of emotion, things like that. Then looking at Richard Thaler, Dan Kahneman, things like that, and how to bring this into an artificial intelligence capability. And so my question was, have you all within your specific research portfolio looked at the emotionality of these surveys that you're looking at? One thing that we've recently discovered specifically throughout COVID has been some of our clients like Pfizer, Moderna, Merck, Novartis, within telehealth specifically, where we have obviously HIPAA compliant data controls, all that kind of good stuff. But between a doctor, a provider, and the patients, right, there's a lot of emotionality. The provider wants their patients to comply with the prescribed care. The patient doesn't want to be entrapped and scared from the prescribed plan of care. And there's a national health crisis that's to the tune of 150,000 lives lost every year because they don't adhere to the prescribed plan of care, whether that's prescription medication, therapies, what have you. And so in that world, we've kind of discovered these core emotions that drive the human decision-making process. Where I work, former intelligence community, CIA, government, things like that, my world's in that world. But
Okay,
within your
Zach,
research specifically, thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead, Stefanie.
Thank you. I think, you know, emotions are a very, very, very important topic. I don't specifically work on that, but I do have some, you know, ongoing thing about how emotions could shape some policy views, specifically things like fear and anger in voting for specific policies related to immigration or climate change, etc. Don't have any results to share. What you're raising is super important about, like, in healthcare or in other topics that I don't necessarily work on, but it's something that I think we can think about much more in terms of public policy, because obviously we're still emotions, emotional beings, and that's probably not something that our policy views and votes are immune to either.
Thank you so much, Stefanie and Beatrice. That was really fabulous. Stefanie, do you have any last remarks you want to make?
Thank you all so much for all the great questions and comments. Lots of food for thought. I know that Beatrice took lots of notes, and we're going to look into that. So thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.